Hello everyone, Books with Banks back again with another Malazan video for you all, and specifically another video about Erikson's Kharkanas prequels. If you haven't already, it would mean a lot if you could like and subscribe, but without any further ado, let's get into it. So I want to look at this question of whether or not history actually repeats itself, or whether or not there are these patterns to historical events that we can pick apart and analyze, but I want to specifically look at this question through the lens of one of Erikson's historian characters in his Kharkanas prequels, the historian Rise Herat. So first and foremost, before we really get to the Malazan part of this, where do we get this idea that history repeats itself from? Well, there's a few quotations and sources we hear on a regular basis, often misquoted and misapplied to all manner of situations outside of its original context. So we have the George Santayana quote from his work in 1905. And this quote is, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And then Winston Churchill would go on to sort of paraphrase this in a speech to Parliament in the 40s, but Churchill changed it to, "Those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it." And while I agree with the sentiment insofar as it encourages reflecting on our history and critical thinking and so on, I also don't think it's a particularly helpful to view history strictly as a series of events that follow any kind of repeatable pattern or course. This almost allows for an element of prediction and future telling and planning that we can do if that were the case. And even though I love Isaac Asimov's Foundation books and Harry Seldon's psychohistory plan for the rest of human civilization, I don't think there's actually a scientific way to use history or the social sciences to really do this, to plan on history repeating itself. I also think it's a fairly reductive way to analyze past events, reducing centuries apart different kind of events to their bare essentials, or not even their essentials, but just their components that might be similar, and ignoring the things that might be different. I think it pays little to no attention to the actual chroniclers or historians recounting those events, or the positions and institutions that those historians themselves were writing from within. So now let's return to the Santayana quote. Again, that's, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." This, in and of itself, is somewhat of a repetition, and I'm not sure how familiar Santayana was with the people I'm about to mention, but I think it's likely he came across their works at some point in time. In 1790, more than a century earlier, Edmund Burke wrote the book Reflections on the Revolution in France, in which he states, quote, "People will not look forward to posterity who never look backward to their ancestors," end quote. Now, Personally, I think I prefer this quote to Santayana's because of the specific language used. I think this is a bit more broadly applicable and sounds to me like it stresses just that it is always a good thing to reflect on the past. Critical thinking, especially when it comes to our own societies and our own histories, is always a constructive exercise. I like this statement because the absence of posterity doesn't necessarily equal repetition and allows for all manner of differences in the future that might deviate from any kind of pattern and not just a repetition of past problems. But backing up to the source of Burke's quotation, Reflections on the Revolution in France, do you know who also really liked to talk about the French Revolution was Karl Marx. And in 1852, a good 6 decades after Burke wrote his quote, in 1852, Karl Marx wrote this essay called The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. In a brief history lesson here, for humanities scholars and academics in the 19th century, the French Revolution and then the following Napoleonic Wars were a really big deal. All, of course, happening between like 1789 through 1815 or so. The more famous Napoleon seized power in 1799, the Napoleon everyone knows, and half a century later, his nephew, Louis Napoleon, aka Napoleon III, seized a dictatorial type of power again. And so Marx, in writing this essay, The 18th Brumaire, he is reacting to this specific historical event when he writes, quote, "Hegel remarks somewhere that all great world historic facts and personages appear, so to speak, twice. He forgot to add the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce." End quote. Who is Hegel and what were Hegel's views on history and the development of the historical timeline? Does humanity continue to grow, progress, advance? And can these repetitions be explained by some world force or world spirit at work guiding things? We could go down a whole tangent with Hegel here and how those questions kind of fit into his philosophy, but I'll spare you kind of that tangent for this video. Anyway, what's important to note here is that Marx, in conversation with his friend Friedrich Engels, often discussed Hegelian philosophy and ideas, and clearly it was out of one of those conversations and correspondences with Engels that Marx is writing this essay about history repeating itself, first as tragedy, then as farce, in this case specifically with the two Napoleons. Again, this is an often misquoted reference, but also one that adds to this belief that history repeats itself in some way, shape, or form. So, in addition to these beliefs of some great thinkers and minds in and around the 19th century, where else do we get this sense of repetition? Of course, this shows up everywhere in religion, beyond just ideas of a second coming of Christ, or whoever the next prophet is going to be, or the cyclical nature of eras and time itself in some concepts of the universe. All of these theistic belief systems and patterns inherent in the narratives of those systems, all of this only enhances, I think, the general public's sort of predisposition to feel like history is at times repeating itself, and to reduce certain historical events and figures to their easily replicated essential elements. But at the end of the day, what elements any given historian chooses to reduce their subjects to, this is all still a narrative choice, and these are all still choices that the historians themselves are making. If a historian wants to highlight certain patterns, this is all up to that particular scholar, that particular individual. One historian might want to draw, let's say, parallels between the executions of Charles I of England and then Louis XVI of France, while another historian might find such a comparison wildly unnecessary or even inappropriate. Long story short, for actual historians, I think contextualizing different similar historical events as repetitions of one another, or thinking about history as being on a course like this, as a sort of more literal way of learning from our mistakes to prevent future mistakes, I think all of this is a valuable and engaging critical thinking exercise, and this is all perfectly acceptable for historians and other scholars to do, to choose to structure their historical retellings along these lines. But I think, as with all other methods, historians themselves need to be very careful in clearly elucidating their method here, and we need to make sure that the thought experiment of these repetitions is treated just as that, as an experiment, and never like the end-all be-all of predicting the future or of historical timelines and finding these patterns. Furthermore, I believe historians should stress that their knowledge of historical events, while at times comes from primary research, often comes from secondary work by other writers and historians, and the patterns we're recognizing in past historical events might only be visible or present because of the way historians framed their retellings of those events. Phew. Okay, so there's my position on that sort of, how does history repeat itself? Is this a useful exercise? Now, what the heck does Malazan and Kharkanas, what does this have anything to do with that? As any Malazan or Kharkanas fans might know, we have the character Rise Herat, Mother Dark's historian, and he appears in first Forge of Darkness, and then this is the second book, Fall of Light, where I'll be quoting from, or reading a few passages from in just a moment. Let's see what Rise Herat has to say about all of this. As many of you know, I presented a paper at this year's ICFA conference. My paper was all about how historian characters are used in works of epic fantasy, so obviously this video kind of very naturally fits into that idea. While my shortened conference presentation version of the paper still did include a little bit about my favorites of Erikson's historians, in hindsight I didn't get to talk about Rise Herat as much as I would have liked to. So Rise Herat is a historian who has basically gotten fed up with his role as a historian as he's grown more and more painfully aware that he's just going through the motions, performing his part in this Shakespearean tragedy. When a historian realizes how subjective, narrativized, and random historical theory and works actually can be in the end, and how a lot of its constructions and narrativized sort of patterns imposed on history by the historians themselves, how can any one practitioner of history continue to write anything with conviction? So this is sort of the mental crisis point that Rise Herat is at. And how can he move on from this? Earlier on in this book, this prequel series, Rise Herat is having a conversation with other important figures in Mother Dark's court, their kind of higher leadership, and his civil war is fast approaching. And what can they do to stop this civil war? This is kind of the question at hand. And Silchus Ruin, a character familiar to fans of this series and of Erikson's Book of the Fallen, Silchus asks Rise if there are any examples of something similar happening in the past that they can now use to prevent the current conflict, or if not prevent it, then at least gain the upper hand. And this is the specific exchange I'm talking about. This is on page 387 of this Bantam edition, this Bantam Mass Market International paperback edition. Okay, again, 387. Silchus faced Rise Herat. Historian, have you perused the most ancient tomes, the moldy scrolls and clay tablets and whatnot? Is there or is there not, here in the Citadel, the gathered literature of our people? Are we indeed in a time without precedent? A time without precedent? Oh, surely we are in such a time. My lord, there are many myths recorded in our library, mostly musing on origins of various things. They seek to map an unknown realm, and where memory does not survive, then imagination serves. He shook his head. I would not put much trust in the veracity of such efforts. All right, a shorter passage there, but as you can see with Rise Herat saying things like a time without precedent, oh, surely we are in such a time. And he also says, where memory does not survive, then imagination serves. I think he would tend to agree with me, at least at this point in the book. He would agree with me in that, for the most part, rejecting much utility and using history to forecast the future or try to avoid certain things. He'd at least say the veracity of how similar and purportedly repeated events, there's not really much veracity in trying to go about using history in that way. But where my love of epic fantasy and my love of historical theory merge beautifully in this book here is in what Erikson does with Rise Herat going forth over the course of the rest of the book. Existing within a world with mythic beings, in particular, you have your Azathanai characters here, sort of demigods, one in particular being Draconis. More important than these people being gods or demigods, though, is in how incredibly long-lived they are and the impact that this can have on any historical timeline. I know this is a longer video, but it really has all been kind of building up to this, how Erikson uses the tools of the genre and the details of his world to make Rise and us readers question our more firmly held beliefs. Quick alert, now I haven't really spoiled much of anything yet, but I am about to talk about one element of the conclusion of this book, Fall of Light, with a fair level of detail, so you've been warned. Here's your spoiler warning. Far off in the distance, the first real full-size battle of the forces of Vatha Urusander's light army versus Mother Dark's army of night. These forces are clashing, though the particulars of the battle are very much left up in the air. Sure, we get a few tidbits here and there. We get 3 or so different accounts of what might have or what could have been happening, which I think is a brilliant deconstruction of the final battle scene in epic fantasy, but I'll have to make a separate video entirely about that. What we need to look at for this video is how Rise Herat has basically bunkered down in the old palace archives, going maybe a little bit insane, terrified of the coming battle, and his role or influence on that battle as historian, and as a historian who so closely serves one group of leaders and not the other, one side of this war and not the other. He's looking at all of the statuary down there, and he also starts looking through the old ancient tapestries. And on one tapestry, he finds a rendering of Draconis going to war and people fighting in the name of Draconis. And he is terrified by how similar this is to the current conflict. Now, to be fair to both Draconis and Mother Dark, they've pretty much been holed up hiding away for this entire book, barely making any appearances except for to ask people to leave them alone and just let them be, let them love one another. But Here's the scene, a little bit of a longer excerpt, when Rise comes upon this tapestry. Okay. Some mindful cleric had tagged each roll and in faded script had written the title and what was known of each piece along with an index number of some sort. If the Citadel's archives held any master list, Herat knew nothing of it. Kneeling, he worked his way through the leather tags dangling from the ends of the rolls, squinting at the embossed script where the ink had faded to almost nothing. At last he found the one he sought. It was a struggle pulling the tapestry from the stack, and his efforts sent many rolls sliding and spilling out to unravel upon the floor. The dust stung his eyes, made his nose run. He felt more than saw moths fluttering about, brushing his skin when he dragged the tapestry clear. Finding a stretch of unobstructed floor, Herat unrolled his prize. Lanterns were no longer necessary, darkness failed, and hiding a thing. More's the pity. He stood and stared down at the vast scene stitched into the fabric. Quote, "The battle of the storm in the founding age," end quote, artist unknown. He had last seen it more than 30 years ago, though he could barely recall the context. Perhaps it had been found in a storage cupboard during one of the many refurbishings of rooms that had occurred as the Citadel's population burgeoned with acolytes, priests, and priestesses, or upon a wall in some long-sealed chamber that had been reopened. The details hardly mattered, the title even less. What battle, what storm, what age of founding? He studied the swarm of figures upon the blasted landscape, the scores of flying dragons treading the dark clouds hanging low over the battlefield. His eyes narrowed on the flanking hilltops where stood the rival commanders of the two armies, locked together between them. From one such figure, tall and martial, something like a stain or scorching marred the weave, blackening the air surrounding the man. He thought it nothing more than damage, the bloom of rotting mold, perhaps, or where a torch had been held too close to the hanging. But now he saw, as he looked more closely, that the very threads were black. It's him, Draconis. The helm hides his face, but the manner of his stance betrays him. That and the darkness, like smoke. I saw it today, as he strode across the Turandai. Abyss below, what have we done? A voice spoke behind him. I sought you upon the tower. Herat closed his eyes, not yet turning to face her. Yet you tracked me here. Your journey was reported, Emerald Lanier replied. This is my temple, after all. Yes, the historian replied, eyes opening again, gaze returning once more to the tapestry laid out on the floor before him. There is honor, he said, and then there is stupidity. What do you mean? Still, he would not turn to face her. If in the course of our lives we find ourselves in the same place, again and again, what lesson is not being heeded? What willful idiocy obtains proof against any self-examination, any reflection or contemplation? How is it, High Priestess, that a single man or woman's life can so bitterly match the history of an entire people? After a long moment, she moved up to stand beside him, her attention fixed upon the tapestry. Draconis, said Herat, has done this before. See him? That wreath of darkness he wears like a cloak, or wings. See the woman at his side? Who was she, I wonder? What forgotten ancestor embraced his gifts, only to vanish from all memory? That is no more than a stain, she said. Your imagination is beggared by truth, he said sharply. Blind yourself if you must. At last I begin to understand. What? What is there to understand, historian? We have done what was needed. No, I think we have failed. What do you mean? We saw Draconis, Kelleras on his heels. They were setting out for the Valley of Tarns. Yes, so that Draconis can retrieve his houseblades. But he won't, Herat said. He can't, don't you see? This is his battle. It's been his war from the very start. We just didn't realize it. All right. So what Erikson has done here is taken this idea of a sort of guiding divine predetermination and said, but what if it wasn't because the god in question had any type of productive goal or any kind of progressive plan and world-guiding spirit for the human race, but that God still was capable of human things like love and like making mistakes. And through that God's personal, possibly destructive actions, he's winding up returning time and time again to that same destructive behavior. So Erikson literalizes this idea of nearly exact repetitions in history, while at the same time making the repetition a difficult thing to really learn from, because it's so closely tied to one incredibly powerful, stubborn individual's will. We feel bad for Draconis, but his actions have such a massive influence over the destructive actions and war at hand. They've had an influence over this type of thing in the past before. The cause of war and the momentum going into this war is so grandiose and simultaneously so personal, and for both reasons, it feels impossible for those in Mother Dark's court to turn their backs on what Draconis and Mother Dark want. And Erikson never provides an easy answer or really answers at all, because even if Rise Herat brought forth this tapestry, and if he had shown this to Silchus Bruin exactly, and shown him exactly what happened in the past based on the tapestry, who's to say that studying the actions of the Teist and the Azathanai back then would have had any preventative effect on the current civil war? If anything, it might have just confirmed for all of them that there was nothing they could do. Sort of this kind of fatalistic kind of, it would have been a sort of, it would have convince them of the sad fate and the irreversibility of the destiny and this kind of these roles they've been cast in, especially because this group that we're talking about, Rise Herat and everyone with Mother Dark, they're not really the aggressors in this conflict, and their actions don't really have anything clearly to correct aside from supporting Draconis and Mother Dark's union. Anyway, all that really just to say that I believe Erikson is brilliantly playing around with one of the most common aphorisms and cliches we hear when we talk about history, and when we have people trying to use historical events and patterns to prevent bad things from happening. Again, Erikson takes this concept and sends all of us right along with Rise Herat into the state of panic and crisis over the frighteningly predetermined nature of all of this because of Draconis, and because in this world, those repetitions can be directly tied to gods or demigods acting on the ground with us here and now, and in this world resisting these patterns could mean betraying the trust of a personal acquaintance. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching, and I definitely plan to start making more and more Kharkanas content. Again, I've really missed adding more analysis videos to this sort of Kharkanas series, and I've missed talking about this series. Next up, I think I'll probably be making in the next month or so a video about the priestesses. There's two priestesses in these books that I'd love to compare, do a sort of comparative analysis of. And then there's also a character who, in my conversation with Erikson a few months ago, he referred to as beyond redemption or irredeemable. And I'm really, I'm excited to get into it, or to make a video analyzing that particular character's story and role in this book, or in this series. I also would like to look maybe a little bit more closely at these sort of Shakespearean stylistic influences on this series, especially as in that interview I did with Erikson, he mentioned that a lot of these characters are sort of playing roles. It's sort of the style of performing your role in this Civil War play. So I'm really excited to get into some more text articles and books and stuff that have analyzed Shakespeare's history plays in particular, and see what I can learn from those books, and see what connections I can draw between Shakespeare's history and Erikson's sort of history that is, or artistic, poetic kind of history that is the Kharkanas trilogy. All that said, thank you again so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye.